Africa is home to the most impressive collection of animals on the planet. In its vast swaths of wilderness live the biggest, smartest, strangest, and most iconic anywhere on the planet. But Africa today is just a shadow of what it once was. Go back a few thousand years and you'd encounter animals unlike any alive today. Elephants wandering the Sahara Desert, lemurs the size of gorillas, and birds standing at 3 meters tall. In this video we'll go through every extinct animal from Africa, from those who vanished as the Ice Age ended, to those that have been driven to extinction in the 21st century. Starting with one of the most amazing yet most mysterious, the elephant bird. This animal is actually not one species but three. The largest of them, Aepyornis maximus, was a titan. It's estimated that when standing, the largest of these giants reached 3.5 meters and up to 800 kilograms, making them the largest birds to ever roam the earth. Their smaller cousin, Melurornis, however, only weighed 80 kilograms, which is actually still huge. The elephant birds belong to a group of flightless birds known as the ratites, with their closest living relative being the kiwi, with whom they split from a jaw-dropping 54 million years ago. It's hypothesized that the ancestor of both kiwis and elephant birds lived in Australia during this time and still possessed flight. Eventually they ended up on both islands where they lost flight due to a lack of predators. It's not known when they first arrived, but clearly it was a long time ago. We know this since the two elephant bird lineage diverged from one another all the way back in the Oligocene 30 million years ago. Now, one thing that's strange about these guys is that they had reduced optic lobes, just like the kiwis. This is an adaptation employed solely by nocturnal species, implying that the elephant birds were very odd for large grazing species. Another thing that scientists have noted is that Aepyornis maximus had a much better sense of smell than its close relative, suggesting that it was adapted for locating food in forest, whilst Hildebranti occupied more open habitats. This idea is backed up by isotope analysis studies, which conclude that the latter had a diet consisting of 48% grazing. And their lifestyle proved successful, as they could be found across the entire island. Yet today, all they have left behind are a few bones and thousands of eggs, so what happened to them? Predictably, it was us humans. But despite people arriving around 2,000 years ago, the elephant bird survived for much longer, possibly into the second millennium. This extinction date coincided with major environmental changes in Madagascar. Around this time, cattle were introduced from Africa, and huge areas of former forest and grassland were burnt for pasture. People certainly hunted them too, perhaps even their eggs, which for a species with a low suspected population would have led to a rapid demise. But the elephant birds weren't the only supersized creatures in Madagascar, as alongside them lived a wide range of giant lemur species. Like their feathered counterparts, after arriving to Madagascar approximately 60 million years ago, the lemurs radiated to fill all the empty niches, some of which required them to grow to huge sizes. One family, the sloth lemurs, spanned 8 species among 4 genera, with the largest, Archaeoindris, weighing in at a staggering 160 kilograms, comparable to a large gorilla today, whilst others like Mesopropithecus were less than 10% of that. They get their name due to their affinity to arboreal sloths, with their characteristic curved finger and toe bones telling us that they were suited for slow suspensory movement. Examining their teeth also reveals similarities with sloths, with wearing indicating a primarily folivorous diet supplemented with seeds. And while these were the biggest, the koala lemur, or Megalodapus, was the weirdest. Coming in at 1.5 meters in length, its strange nose accompanied by a big upper lip resembles that of a rhinoceros more closely than a primate's. But most bizarrely of all, its eyes were on the side of its skull, not the front like every other primate, probably to better detect predators while feeding. These traits, along with its greatly reduced brain size, hint at an existence much like the koala, though just much larger. The monkey lemurs, on the other hand, adapted to fill the role of, you guessed it, monkeys. No doubt these were the most terrestrial kind of lemurs, as indicated by their short forelimbs and flat fingers. Unlike the other specialized types, monkey lemurs had a more general diet, which is fairly rare for extinct animals. Then there was the pachylemur, who was basically the giant relatives of modern-day rough lemurs. And when I say giant, I mean it, as they clocked in at 3 times the size of their cousins. Despite this, they actually differed little in morphology, suggesting a very similar existence to the rough lemurs, meaning they ate a lot of fruit. Though unlike today, the pachylemurs lived in the southwest and southern portion of the island, which is now dry. Finally, this brings us to the most mysterious extinct lemur, the giant aye-aye. The few fossils found don't tell us much, just that it was much bigger, possibly 2.5 times as much, and hunted in a similar way to the modern eye, using its finger to drill into wood for insects. So what caused these amazing creatures to disappear? Well, due to less material, the timing of their extinctions are harder to pinpoint than that of the elephant birds. However, most remains date to before 1000 AD, and only the giant eye possibly survived until European arrival, around 400 years later. Given that the extinct species were large and diurnal, they would have been much easier to hunt. The majority of extinctions occurred in the drier regions, particularly in the central highlands, where only small patches of forest and thus habitat remains for lemurs. And while habitat loss certainly played a role, the fact that it was the biggest species that went extinct suggests hunting was the main cause here. This is also likely the explanation for why the 3 Malagasy hippo species disappeared. Each much smaller than their mainland relative, they comprise the only hoofed animals to have ever lived in Madagascar. Slow creatures like these who inhabited open marshes would have been even easier to hunt than the giant lemurs, and one by one they were hunted to extinction. Despite this, a bone as well as descriptions from locals indicate that these hippos survived into even the 20th century undetected, and some believe they could still be out there to this day. But with all of these herbivores, there must have been giant predators. One of them was the giant fossa, whose massive jaws and teeth were specialized to hunt those large lemurs, and once those disappeared, it wouldn't have been able to compete with the smaller fossa. However, if you lived in Madagascar in that time, the voe would have definitely been the predator you feared the most. This 4-meter long croc was the island's biggest predator, but it's not really known what wiped it out, especially since the Nile crocodile survives on Madagascar today. But Madagascar's story is just the beginning, as the rest of Africa experienced even more extinctions, especially in the northern part of the continent. Now, one thing that's quite strange is that many large fossil mammals have been found in the Sahara, including the African giant buffalo, the deer Megaceroids, the North African zebra, the North African horse, the North African elephant, and my personal favorite, an extinct relative of the white rhino known as Ceratotherium moritacanum. Of course, these are all grassland species which could not possibly survive the Sahara's arid conditions. But during most of the current epoch, the Sahara went through a phase known as the African humid period, which saw savannas dominate the now desolate environment. This came to an end around 5,500 years ago due to changes in the Earth's tilt, and the creatures that once inhabited it died out. However, the North African elephant, possibly an entirely separate species, managed to survive into Roman times, most likely along the Nile River Valley and the Red Sea's coast. But the Nile didn't just serve as a refuge for elephants. The aurochs, once also widespread across North Africa as well as all of Eurasia, clung on in the Nile Delta along with the grey wolf, Syrian bear, and golden-stat shrew. Fortunately, all of these except the aurochs survived elsewhere and could be possibly reintroduced one day. However, one creature that wasn't so lucky was the balsam shrew. Known from mummified remains dating to between the 9th and 2nd centuries BC, it was presumably a swamp forest specialist whose entire habitat was cleared for agriculture. Some species, however, never even made it to the advent of agriculture. In East Africa's savanna, in what's now Kenya and Tanzania, lived Damaliscus hypsodon, a species of antelope related to the living bontebok. First discovered in 1990, its fossils date to between 392 and 12,000 years ago. Given the limited information on this animal, it's impossible to know what caused its extinction. So to get an idea, we need to know what wiped out other hoofed animals on the continent, many of which come from South Africa. And although the region has lost many species in recent centuries, it actually lost a few in prehistoric times, one of which was the giant Cape zebra. As its name suggests, it was noticeably bigger than living zebras today, standing at roughly 1.5 meters tall and weighing 400 kilograms. Sticking with the trend of larger versions of living animals were the giant wildebeests. Oddly enough, these guys weren't technically wildebeest, and instead fell into their own genus Megalotragus, consisting of 3 species. And they were big. The tips of their horns are estimated to have sat 1.2 meters apart. They also shed a head more consistent with that of the hartebeest, with the name wildebeest coming from similar body proportions. Then there's Bond springbok, whose range encompassed both Zimbabwe and South Africa. All of these animals disappeared by 5,000 years ago, and here the cause of extinction doesn't seem to be human related. Each of them is suspected to have been more specialized to a specific diet than their modern counterparts, which would have made them more vulnerable to habitat changes after the end of the Ice Age and African humid period. However, for species that became extinct in the last few centuries, a natural change in the climate being the main driver is unlikely, but it can certainly still be a factor, such as in the story of the bluebuck. In the Pleistocene, this animal ranged throughout the southern part of modern-day South Africa, but by the time Europeans arrived, it was restricted to a much smaller tract of land near Cape Town, with genetics showing a smaller population with a history of decline for over 400,000 years. This meant that it didn't take many trophy hunters to finish them off, and the last official reports date to around 1800. This was followed by the extinction of the Cape lion, the Cape warthog, and the iconic quagga, each hunted to extinction, though unlike the bluebuck, these were thankfully only subspecies. But aside from these sad tales, one South African animal actually has a happy story: De Winton's golden mole. Found in just a tiny area of shrubland along the Atlantic coast, the elusive animal was presumed extinct after having disappeared in 1937. However, given that extensive searches hadn't been taken, the possibility of survival remained fairly high. And in 2017, a program searching for 25 lost species was initiated. Remarkably, after testing environmental DNA and employing the help of sniffer dogs, in 2023 they were rediscovered, though they are still thought to be rare and threatened by habitat destruction. Although the southern tip of the continent has faced its fair share of extinctions, the northern edge has arguably been hit even harder. The Atlas Mountains in particular serve as a humid refuge among the endless deserts and support a much greater variety of species than the surrounding landscape. And unlike the rest of Africa, the animals that live here primarily originate from the Palearctic realm. The first animal to disappear from these lands was the Atlas wild ass. Descriptions of this animal hint that it was much darker than other subspecies, backed up by rock art and Roman mosaics. In fact, it's from these mosaics that we can estimate its extinction, as the most recent dates are around 300 AD in Algeria. It's likely that Roman sport hunting drove them to the edge, but since the other extinct animals from here lived into modern times, we have a much clearer idea of what caused their demise. Among them are the Barbary lion, the Barbary leopard, the Atlas bear, and the Bubur hartebeest. This time, the introduction of firearms and bounties led to all of these creatures disappearing, with big predators being the targets. It is often the case that large predators such as big cats are the first animals to go extinct in an ecosystem due to their small population densities and threats they pose to people. And this is exactly the case in Zanzibar. Whilst it's debated if it truly is a unique subspecies, it is certainly distinct from those on the mainland. After sea levels lowered, it became isolated on the island, and evolved to become much smaller and lose its characteristic rosettes. In terms of behavior, not much is known since it has never been studied in the wild. Its decline began when human population on the island grew over the 20th century, leading to encroachment on its habitats. Conflict between people and the Zanzibar leopard led to localized campaigns at extermination, which grew into island-wide campaigns in the 1960s. By the 1990s, the Zanzibar leopard was considered extinct. However, reports by locals of them preying on livestock mean that it's possible that they are still out there, though the chances of that are slim. But one region, the Horn of Africa, has several extinct species which are much more likely to survive. The Ethiopian amphibious rat, for example, hasn't been seen since 1927. But because its habitat in the Ethiopian highlands has not been explored deeply, it is only listed as possibly extinct. The same goes for Cheeseman's Vlay rat, who hasn't been seen since 1937, but it's the Mount Kenya potso that I believe has the highest chances of survival. Endemic to, of course, Mount Kenya, it was last seen in 1938. Having disappeared in a completely intact habitat, it's likely that this animal can still be found in some unexplored slopes of the mountain. Unfortunately, this possibility doesn't exist for the extinct subspecies of rhino. The black rhino was once found across most of Africa, with a population numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and thus many unique subspecies developed. This flourishing came to an end when trophy hunters from Europe arrived in Africa, leading to the southern black rhino's extinction by 1850. By 1900, the northeastern black rhino from Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia had been wiped out too. But just as trophy hunting died down, demand for rhino horns in East Asia surged, and the decline of the black rhino accelerated. By the 21st century, only a few thousand remained, and the western black rhino was in a particularly bad spot. In 2000, only 10 remained. In just 1 year, this figure dwindled to 5. And in 2006, the last sighting was made in northern Cameroon. Luckily, the black rhino has been brought back from the brink, and their population now stands at almost 7,000. But the white rhino isn't in such a good spot, declining from over 21,000 a decade ago to under 16,000 today. And while not technically extinct, the northern white rhino, with only 2 females left, is doomed. They had once inhabited the upper reaches of the Nile in the Congo, Uganda, Sudan, and Central Africa, but were last seen in 2007. Since then, the captive population has declined from 10 to 2, and their extinction is imminent. And even though hearing about a subspecies go extinct is devastating, it's much worse when a fully distinct species is wiped out, especially when that species is the only primate to have gone extinct in modern times. I am of course talking about Miss Waldron's red colobus, which previously lived in the coastal forest of the Ivory Coast and Ghana. Both habitat loss and hunting for bushmeat pushed them to the brink, and there have been no confirmed sightings since 1978. But it wasn't just mammals that vanished from Africa's landscapes. Now it's time to turn our attention to extinct birds, which the continent certainly has no shortage of, a great deal of whom were found in Morocco. The most surprising, the great auk. Despite being the Arctic's most iconic extinct animal, fossils from 3,850 years ago along Morocco's coast tell us that they historically ventured much further south. Ultimately, they were hunted to extinction in the north, and as migratory birds that would have also led to their presence disappearing from everywhere in their range. For the next 2 extinct birds, the Moroccan bustard and Moroccan guinea fowl, both subspecies, we really don't know what drove them to extinction. However, we do have a slightly clearer picture for the slender-billed curlew. This bird had a vast yet fragmented range across Eurasia, particularly around the Mediterranean, Black, Red, and Arabian seas, with inland populations documented in Southeast Europe and Central Asia. Rather than a sudden drop, the slender-billed curlew faced a slow and steady decline to the brink, until it was seen for the last time in Morocco in 1995. The cause of their decline was largely unknown until an isotopic analysis study in 2018 revealed their breeding grounds to be the Kazakh steppe. Now things start to make sense. Kazakhstan ranks worst in the world for biodiversity intactness. For millennia, pastoralists have overgrazed this land. And then came the final blow in the 1950s, as the Soviet Union pushed for the Kazakh steppe to be transformed into a wheat-growing powerhouse. Declines of local birds were noted, and there is no doubt that this pushed the slender-billed curlew to the brink. As I'm sure you're aware, islands are much more vulnerable to extinctions, both due to naturally small populations and the lack of competitors or predators. Whilst the Indian Ocean islands may be the first that come to mind, on the other side of Africa in the Atlantic sit a number of remote islands, each of which evolved their own endemic fauna. Unfortunately, when these islands were discovered, invasive species were brought over and caused the extinction of most of the endemic species. The first of these islands to be discovered was Ascension in 1501. Oddly enough, the 2 extinct birds from this island are only known from their fossils, despite surviving past discovery. These are the Ascension night heron and the Ascension crake, both of whom were probably flightless and thus vulnerable to predators. Rats were first introduced in the 18th century and may have eaten their eggs, though it's more likely that it was the cats, introduced in 1815, that drove them to extinction. The Ascension crake was so distinct that it was placed in its own genus, suggesting it had called the island home for millions of years. Right after Ascension, in 1502, St. Helena was discovered. The island's large petrel, small petrel, crake, swamp hen, dove, cuckoo, shearwater, and most infamously hoopoe all vanished within a matter of decades. The St. Helena hoopoe was particularly unique. It was larger than its mainland ancestor, and its reduced wing bones as well as more robust legs suggest that it was flightless. Presumably, it fed on the also extinct St. Helena earwig. As a flightless bird, it would have no way to escape from cats, and its eggs may have been susceptible to predation by rats. In fact, the species is actually only known from bones, as no one is recorded as ever having seen one. Then finally, in 1520, the archipelago of Tristan da Cunha was discovered. These islands actually fared much better than the others, only the Tristan moorhen was wiped out. Other endemic species such as the spectacled petrel, the Tristan albatross, the Tristan thrush, and the inaccessible island rail survived, as the more rugged terrain and harsh weather has made it difficult for feral cats and rats to gain a foothold. These conditions, as well as the remote location, explain why the South Atlantic islands never had any native land reptiles. But in the North Atlantic, off the coast of the Sahara, the Macaronesian islands produce ideal conditions for them. Today, we'll just be taking a look at Cape Verde, as the other archipelagos are considered part of Europe. Although there is basically zero information about it, including when it went extinct, it is known that a relative of the African spurred tortoise survived into modern times here. We do, however, know a lot more about the Cape Verde giant skink, formerly endemic to the Northern Islands, which in prehistoric times were part of one landmass. Their ancestors arrived from West Africa during the late Miocene or early Pliocene, before evolving into skinks of various sizes. As indicated by its name, it was much larger than any of its relatives, reaching 32 centimeters in length. Observers of the animal noted its ability to climb, which surprised contemporary naturalists who had only encountered skinks from more arid islands. Whilst frequently seen in the 18th century, it temporarily disappeared until it was rediscovered in 1873. But by then the species may have already been doomed. Goats had severely damaged the island's native habitats, and feral cats preyed upon the lizards, as did human settlers. By 1915, it was reported that recently introduced dogs had killed off the entire population, and they were never seen again. Another African skink, Gunther's dwarf burrowing skink, from South Africa, had a much less known story, since only one individual in 1887 was found and is now presumed extinct. A similar thing happened to Eastwood's long-tailed seps, only known from 2 individuals collected in 1911. And whilst it was reptiles that faced the most extinctions back then, today it is amphibians that are the most imperiled, which unsurprisingly holds true for Africa. Thus far, the Amani forest frog, the overlooked squeaker frog, the beautiful metallic toad, the cave squeaker, Poynton's forest toad, Detroit's torrent frog, Osgood's Ethiopian toad, and the Manengalba river frog are believed to be extinct. Some of the dates of the last sightings are from a very long time ago, but this is likely explained by a lack of surveys rather than the actual timing. Because it's in the recent decades that a deadly force began killing off amphibians, chytridiomycosis. This deadly fungal disease is one of the greatest threats to biodiversity today, having claimed over 200 species already. Considering this, Africa got hit lightly. Extinction patterns suggest that the fungus spread across East Africa around 2002. Before arriving near Mount Oku in Cameroon around 2009. Okay, so we have finally covered every single extinction from continental Africa, leaving just the Indian Ocean islands. And one of the most fascinating group of animals to have called these islands home are the giant tortoises. Today, only the Aldabra giant tortoise from the Aldabra Atoll survives. But as recently as just the 18th century, far more species were present. These include 3 only known from fossils: the abrupt giant tortoise, Grandidier's giant tortoise, and Astrocheles rogerburi. As large, slow-moving, and thus easy to catch animals, you can imagine they would succumb to human hunting. The most recent fossils date to quite recently, however, between 1230 and 1315 AD. Then there are the species that survived well into recent history. They are the Reunion giant tortoise, the saddle-backed Mauritius giant tortoise, the domed Mauritius giant tortoise, the domed Rodriguez giant tortoise, and the saddleback Rodriguez giant tortoise, all of whom belong to the now extinct Cylindranthropus genus. This genus diverged from their closest relatives 40 million years ago, all the way back in the Eocene, and even within them the divides are deep, with the domed Mauritius giant tortoises splitting from the others 28 million years ago, for example, before the current islands even existed. Their isolation for so long without predators caused them to lose fear, making them very easy for people to hunt. People first arrived to these islands in 1663, and in 1840 the last sighting was made. But for most of the native creatures, it was competition with invasive species that caused their demise. The Rodriguez day gecko and the Rodriguez giant day gecko quickly vanished after cats and rats were introduced, whereas the skink Gongylomorphus borbonicus from Reunion seems to have been eaten to extinction by oriental wolf snakes. 2 other species, the Reunion and Mauritian giant skinks, were unfortunately never seen in person and are only known from subfossils, though both are presumed to have survived until the introduction of rats in the 17th century. Another lesser known species, Hofstadter's worm snake, is also only known from subfossils. However, the round island burrowing boa actually survived until recently, Presumably, in historical times, it lived across Mauritius and its surrounding islands, but by the late 20th century, it only survived on a small and remote round island. Already rare, its fate was sealed with the introduction of rabbits and goats, who together ate so much of the vegetation that the soil began to erode. The last individual was seen in 1974. Fortunately for the island's other endemics, the introduced species have been removed, and native populations have increased. But on these islands, it was not reptiles, but birds that took the bulk of extinctions. In fact, there are so many that if I examined each one, this video would be well over an hour long. So instead, I can only briefly mention each. All 43 of them. The Réunion shelled goose, the Mauritius shelled goose, the stout-legged duck, the mascarene teal, the Réunion pochard, the Mauritius blue pigeon, the Rodrigues blue pigeon, the Réunion blue pigeon, the Mauritian turtle dove, the Réunion pink pigeon, the Rodrigues pigeon, the Rodrigues solitaire, the famous dodo, the red rail, the Réunion rail, Cheke's wood rail, the Rodrigues rail, the mascarene coot, the Réunion swamp hen, Bourne's petrel, the Réunion ibis, the Réunion night heron, the Mauritius night heron, the Rodrigues night heron, the Réunion scops owl, the Rodrigues scops owl, the Mauritius scops owl, the Réunion kestrel, the broad-billed parrot, the mascarene parrot, the Réunion parrot, the Rodrigues parrot, the mascarene grey parakeet, the Réunion parakeet, Newton's parakeet, the Rodrigues bulbul, the Mauritius starling, the Hoopoe starling, the Rodrigues starling, and the Réunion fody. All of them succumb to human hunting, introduced predators, or a combination of the two, with most disappearing in the 17th or 18th centuries. The Seychelles to the north also experienced a devastatingly high number of bird extinctions, including the Assumption Island cuckoo, the Providence blue pigeon, the Amaranti turtle dove, the Seychelles turtle dove, the Assumption white-throated rail, the Seychelles swamp hen, the Seychelles parakeet, the Aldabra bush warbler, and the Marianne white-eye. Madagascar too lost many birds: the Malagasy crowned eagle, an apex predator of lemurs, the Amposa ground roller, the Madagascar cormorant, the Malagasy lapwing, the Hova gallinule, the ancient kua, Bertha's kua, the Malagasy shelled goose, and the Malagasy shell duck had already become extinct prior to European arrival due to a combination of hunting and habitat loss. Delalande's kua and the Alouatta grebe, on the other hand, did survive to be seen by Western science, but were ultimately killed off due to introduction of invasive species and habitat loss. But birds aren't the only flying animals to inhabit the Indian Ocean Islands. Though the reason isn't known, two species of bat known from the current epoch's fossil record are now extinct, those being Trionops goodmani and Hippoceterus besauica. Even the two more recently extinct bats, the small Mauritian flying fox and the lesser yellow bat, went extinct without anyone knowing why. Okay, so now we just have one creature left to go, and I have left one of the most interesting for last. It's known as the Bibi Malagasy, or the Malagasy aardvark. The latter's name comes from the fact that when their fossils were first found, they were placed within the same family as the aardvark. However, now it's known they are more closely related to Tenrex, a group of mammals endemic to Madagascar. The three species have been found around the south, central, and northern parts of the island, and they are believed to have been termite feeding specialists. These animals are very mysterious and we don't really know much about them. Theories for their extinction are few and far between, but burning of their habitat was possibly the cause. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe and I will see you in the next one.